In the autumn of 1887, in the high pine country of the Bitterroot Valley and western Montana Territory, a girl of 19 stood at the back of a county auction and watched a crowd of grown men laugh at a building that no one else would touch. The building was a gatehouse, a squat stone structure of 2 rooms at the mouth of an abandoned mining road, and it had stood empty for 11 years, its roof half fallen, its door hanging by one hinge, its windows long since taken by weather and by boys with stones. The auctioneer had tried to open the bidding at $50, then at $20, then at $5, and met only silence and the shuffling of boots. The girl had $4 to her name and nothing else in the world, and when the auctioneer in weary jest said he would sell the cursed pile of rocks for a single dollar to be rid of it, she lifted her hand. The men laughed. She paid her dollar and she signed the paper, and she became the owner of a ruin that everyone in the valley agreed was worth less than the ink that recorded the sale. What none of them knew, and what she did not yet know either, was that beneath the rotted plank floor of the smaller room there was an iron safe set into the foundation, a thing that had been closed in the spring of 1876 and had not been opened since. 11 years of silence sat in that small, dark box. The story of how it came to be there and of what it held, and of the wrong it would finally set right, is the story of that $1 and the girl who was not too proud to spend it. Stay with me, because what she found under that floor had been waiting 11 years for the one pair of hands in the territory that could open it. Her name was Hannah Crail, and she had come into that autumn with less than most people lose in a bad week. Her father had been a locksmith and a safe man in the railroad town of Drummond, 40 miles east, a quiet craftsman who fitted strong boxes for freight offices and mended the locks of half the county, and he had taught her his trade from the time she could hold a file. He had died in the winter past of a fever that took him in 9 days, and the men who held the note on his shop had taken the shop, the tools, the bench, and the small house behind it, and had left her the clothes she stood in, and a leather satchel of hand tools they judged too worn to sell. She had walked out of Drummond with that satchel over her shoulder and a determination not to weep where anyone could see her, and she had drifted west into the Bitterroot looking for work that a girl with a locksmith's hands might do, and had found none, because no one in that country would hire a girl to do a man's careful work. The satchel held the whole of her inheritance. There was a set of picks her father had ground from clock springs, a brass tension wrench worn smooth at the grip, a small steel drill and a hand brace, 3 files of decreasing fineness, a tin of graphite, and a stethoscope of the medical kind that her father had bought from a doctor in Helena and converted to his own use. For he had taught her that a good, safe man does not force a lock, but listens to it. She had his hands and she had his ear, and in the spring she had turned 20, would still be months away, and she had a $1 gatehouse, and $4 less the dollar she had spent, which left her 3, and the autumn was turning hard. The gatehouse sat where the old Callaway mining road left the valley floor and climbed into the timber, and it had been built, men said, by the Callaway Land and Freight Company in the years when that company had owned half the valley and meant to own the rest. The company was gone now. It had failed in a manner that the older people in the valley spoke of carefully, and the younger ones did not understand. A failure that had ruined a number of families and enriched no one anybody could name, and the gatehouse had been part of the wreckage left behind, a thing too far from town and too small to bother tearing down. Hannah walked out to it the morning after the auction with her satchel on her shoulder and $3 in her boot, and she stood in the cold and looked at what she owned. The roof of the larger room had fallen inward, and a young fir had taken root in the rubble and grown to the height of a man. The stone walls, though, were sound. Whoever had laid them well, 2 feet thick, and squared true, and the smaller of the 2 rooms still had its roof and 3 of its 4 walls dry. She set her satchel on the one surviving sill, and she began. That first day, not with any thought of treasure, for she had none, but with the plain need of a person who must have shelter before the snow. She cleared the fallen fur. She swept the smaller room with a broom of fir boughs, and when she had swept it down to the plank floor, she found that the planks in one corner did not sound like the planks elsewhere. A locksmith's daughter learns the language of sound before she learns much else. Her father had taught her that the world tells the truth to anyone patient enough to listen, that a wall speaks differently where there is a cavity behind it, that a floor speaks differently where there is space below. She knelt in the corner and she rapped her knuckles along the planks, and where the rest of the floor answered with the flat, dead note of wood laid on packed earth, 4 planks in the corner answered with a hollow ring. She sat back on her heels in the cold light coming through the broken window, and she understood that there was something under the floor of the gatehouse she had bought for $1, and the first true feeling she had that morning was not greed. It was the old, steady curiosity her father had carried his whole life, the wish to know what a thing held. She did not tear up the floor that day. She had learned patience from a man who would sit before a stubborn lock for 3 hours without forcing it, and she had learned that haste ruins more work than any other fault. She finished making the room fit to sleep in. She hung a horse blanket over the doorway against the wind. She built a small fire in the corner where an old stovepipe still ran up through the stone, and she ate the last of the bread she had carried from the valley, and she slept that night above whatever it was the hollow planks concealed, and she did not sleep badly. In the morning she lifted the planks. They had been nailed down with square-cut nails gone to rust, and she drew them with the claw of her father's hammer, careful not to split the wood, for she meant to lay them back. And when the 4th plank came up, she sat looking at what the hollow ring had promised. Set into the stone foundation, its top flush with the level of the joists, was the door of an iron safe. It was not a large safe. It was perhaps 2 feet across and as deep a floor safe of the kind that a careful company sets into the foundation of a building meant to last, where it cannot be carried off and cannot be easily reached. The door was square and heavy, painted once in black enamel, now gone to a fine red rust, the color of dried blood, and in the center of it was a combination dial of nickel that had tarnished to the gray of an old coin, and below the dial a brass plate, and on the plate, when she rubbed away the grime with her thumb, a maker's name. The safe had been made by the Mosler Company of Cincinnati, and it had been good work when it was new. She did not feel in that moment that she had found a fortune. She felt that she had found a question. A floor safe set into a company gatehouse at the mouth of an abandoned road, sealed and forgotten, closed at some hour that no one living seemed to remember, was a thing that asked to be opened not for what might be inside, but because a locked thing is an unanswered question, and she was her father's daughter, and she could not leave a question alone. What she did not yet know was that the answer inside that safe would undo a man who still walked the streets of the valley town in a good coat and would return to a family, their name, and would settle a debt 11 years old. That, though, is ahead of the story. On that first morning, all she had was the dial under her hand and the cold of the iron coming up through her glove, and the knowledge that she had no money, no help, and no one in the world who expected her to succeed. She began the way her father had taught her, which was to learn the lock before she touched it. She cleaned the dial and the door with a rag and a little of the lamp oil she had, and she examined the bolt work as far as she could see it, and she found that the safe was a 4-wheel combination lock, which meant a great many possible numbers, more than a person could try in a year of trying. Her father had told her that no honest man tries every number. A safe man, he said, does not fight the lock. He persuades it. He listens for the places where the wheels want to settle, and he reads the small, honest sounds the mechanism makes, and he lets the lock tell him its own secret. It was slow work, and it was the only work she knew, and she had nothing but time. She made her stethoscope ready. The rubber tubing had gone stiff with the years, and she warmed it at the fire to soften it, and she fitted the bell of it against the door of the safe, beside the dial, and she put the tips in her ears, and she began to turn the dial slowly, a number at a time, listening. The valley outside was silent with the silence of coming winter. Inside the gatehouse there was only the small scrape of the dial and the catch of her own breath, and when she found the first contact point, the faint click that her father had taught her to love, above almost any sound in the world. It is here that I must tell you something of the man whose safe it was, because the story is as much his as it is hers, though he and Hannah Crail never once spoke. His name was Mr. Alvin Tate, and in the spring of 1876 he had been the secretary and bookkeeper of the Callaway Land and Freight Company, the man who kept the ledgers and held the keys and knew where every dollar in the company went, which was more than the owner himself could say. The Callaway Company had been built on the savings of ordinary families. It had sold shares to homesteaders and shopkeepers and widows, small sums of $50 and $100, with the promise that the company's freight road and its land would make those small sums grow. For a time the company prospered, and then it did not. And in the spring of 1876 it failed, and the families who had trusted it lost everything they had put in. What the valley believed and had believed for 11 years was that the company had simply failed, as companies do, that the money had been lost in bad ventures and worse luck, and that no one was to blame but the times. What only Alvin Tate knew was that the money had not been lost. In the last months before the failure, while the family still believed their shares were sound, Tate had quietly drawn the company's remaining funds out of its accounts in coin and currency, had falsified the ledgers to show the money spent on debts and freight that never existed, and had hidden the cash where no one would think to look, in the floor safe of a gatehouse at the mouth of a road that was already going to weeds. He had meant to let a year or two pass, to let the failure be forgotten, and then to retrieve the money and begin a new life far away. A man's plans, though, are not the only forces in the world. In the autumn of that year, Tate had been thrown from a horse and had struck his head, and when he recovered, he was not the man he had been. His memory of the months around the failure came back to him in pieces and never whole, and the location of the safe, the gatehouse, the road, the very fact of the money, all of it sank into the fog of the injury and would not come clear. He knew only that he had done something he could not name, and that there was a thing he had forgotten that he needed badly to remember, and the not remembering had eaten at him for 11 years. He still lived in the valley town. He had taken a small clerk's position at the land office, and he wore a good coat grown shabby at the cuffs, and he was known as a careful, quiet man who troubled no one, and the families he had ruined passed him on the street without knowing what he had done to them because he scarcely knew it himself. The wrong he had committed was not a wrong he could confess, because the part of him that knew it had been broken 11 years before. And the proof of it, the falsified ledgers and the hidden money and the true account of where the family's savings had gone, sat under a rotted floor in an iron box that he could no longer find. Hannah Crail knew none of this when she fitted her father's stethoscope to the door of the safe. She knew only that there was a lock, and that she had been taught to open locks, and that the opening of this one had become the single task of her days. She worked at it for the better part of a week. She would rise with the light, build her fire, eat what little she had, and kneel before the safe with the stethoscope in her ears, turning the dial through its slow degrees, listening for the wheels to give up their contact points one at a time. Her knees ached from the cold stone. Her fingers grew raw. Twice she found a wheel and then lost it again and had to begin from the start. And on the fourth day she wept once, briefly and angrily, not from despair, but from the simple exhaustion of a body that was not getting enough to eat, and then she wiped her face and went back to the dial, because weeping opened no locks. There was a method to it that her father had drilled into her until it was no longer thought, but instinct. The 4 wheels of the lock sat one behind the other on a single spindle, and each had a notch cut in its edge, and when all 4 notches lined up beneath the fence, the bolt could draw and the door would open. The trick of it, her father had said, was that the wheels were not perfectly silent. When the dial turned, the wheels picked up one by one, and at the edge of each there was a tiny imperfection in the metal, a place where the manufacturer's machining had left the smallest catch, and a patient ear pressed to the door could hear, beneath the general scrape, the faint individual voice of each wheel as it came into play. She charted those voices on her scrap of paper. She turned the dial to the right through several full revolutions to set all the wheels moving together, and then crept it slowly, leftward, counting. And where she heard the first small click she made a mark, and she did this 100 times and more until the marks clustered, and she knew where that wheel wished to rest. Then she did it again for the second wheel, and the third. It was the slowest work she had ever done, slower than any lock her father had set her to in Drummond, because her hands were cold and her belly was empty and the stone bit into her knees. And more than once she pressed the stethoscope so hard to the iron that her arm went numb to the shoulder, and she had to stop and shake the feeling back into it before she could go on. On the third day of her work, an old man came up the mining road. He came on foot, leading a mule loaded with traps, for he ran a line for marten and fox in the high timber, and had done so for 30 years, and he stopped at the Gatehouse because he had seen the smoke of her fire, where no smoke had risen in 11 years. His name was Eli Boone, and he was perhaps 70, weathered to the color and hardness of a fence post, with a white beard stained yellow at the corner of his mouth and eyes that had not missed much in 70 years. He stood in the broken doorway and looked at the girl kneeling before the open floor and the iron door, and he said only that he had not known anyone owned the place. She told him she had bought it. She told him the price because she had decided she would not be ashamed of it, and the old man laughed, but it was not the laugh of the men at the auction. It was the laugh of a man who has lived long enough to enjoy a thing that turns out backward from how it looks. He came in and crouched by the safe and looked at it for a long while, and then he looked at her, and he asked her whether she knew what building she was sitting in. She said she knew it was a Callaway Gatehouse. The old man was quiet a moment, and then he told her that he had put money into the Callaway Company in 1874, $60, the savings of 4 years of trapping, and that he had lost every cent of it when the company failed, and that he was one of the lucky ones. Because he was an old bachelor with no family to feed, and the $60 had only been pride. Others, he said, had lost more than pride. He did not believe there was anything in the safe. He said the company had failed because the money was gone. Everyone knew that, and a man did not lock an empty box and walk away from it. He was old, though, and the season was slow, and the girl interested him, and he stayed. He made a better camp than she had been able to. He set snares and brought in rabbits, and he showed her which roots in the timber could be eaten, and he mended the doorway with split shakes, so the wind did not cut through the blanket. He did not believe in the safe, but he believed in not letting a girl starve through her own stubbornness, and so the two of them kept a kind of company through the days while she worked the lock and he worked his line, and in the evenings he told her what he remembered of the Callaway Company and the families it had ruined. He told her of the Marsh family, who had put in $200 meaning to buy a second quarter section, and had instead lost the first and gone east, broken. He told her of the widow, Aldous, who had given the company $140, the whole of what her husband had left her, on the word of the company secretary that it was as safe as money in a bank, and who had died 3 years later in the county poorhouse. He told her of others, and he told her without making much of it that the company secretary, the man who had kept the books and given his word to the widow, still lived in the valley town and worked at the land office and was called Mr. Tate, and was reckoned a harmless sort, and that the old man had never been able to look at him without a coldness, though he could not have said the man had done anything but keep the books of a company that failed. Hannah listened and turned the dial and said little, but the names settled into her. She had thought, when she began, that she was opening a lock for the sake of the question. Now she understood that the question had people attached to it, the widow dead in the poorhouse, the family gone east broken, the old man beside her who had lost 4 years of his life, $60 at a time, and the work changed under her hands. It was no longer only a thing she did because she could. It was a thing she did because the box held an answer that belonged to people who had been told there was no answer. On the 7th day, she found the last wheel. She had 3 of the 4 contact points charted on a scrap of paper in the careful figures her father had taught her, and through the long morning she worked the 4th, turning the dial a number at a time. The stethoscope pressed so hard against the iron that it left a ring on her brow. The old man had gone up his line and she was alone, which she was glad of, because the finding of the last wheel was a private thing between her and the lock and the dead man who had taught her. The wheel gave up its place. A little after noon she charted it. She drew the wheels into their alignment, one number, the next, the last, and she felt rather than heard the bolt-work shift, the small, heavy certainty of a mechanism that has been persuaded at last to do the thing it was made to do. She did not open the door at once. She sat back on her heels and she put her cold hands inside her shawl, and she let herself feel for a moment the thing she had not let herself feel in the 11 days since the auction, which was that she had done it, that the hands her father gave her had been equal to the task, that she was not the worthless thing the valley had judged her to be. Then she put her hand on the cold nickel handle and she turned it, and the door of the safe came open on hinges that had not moved in 11 years, and the air that came out of it was the still cold air of a thing sealed in another decade, and she looked into the dark of the box. It is a strange thing to open a sealed room that time has not touched. What she saw first was canvas, 2 stout sacks of gray canvas tied at the neck with cord, and behind them a flat tin document box, and the smell that rose was of old paper and oil and the particular mineral cold of coin. She lifted out the first sack, and the weight of it told her what it was before she loosed the cord, and when she loosed it, she saw the dull gleam of gold and silver coin, double eagles and dollars and half-dollars, more money than she had ever seen or imagined. The savings of the families of the valley, drawn out and hidden by the man who had sworn it was safe. She did not exult. She set the sack down very carefully as a person sets down a thing that is not hers, and she opened the tin document box, and there she found what mattered more than the money. The box held the true ledgers. Alvin Tate had been too careful a bookkeeper to destroy his own record, or perhaps too proud of the cleverness of it, and he had kept in the box a full and honest account of what he had done, the real figures set against the false ones he had entered in the company books, the dates, the sums, the names of every family, and the amount each had been cheated of. He had written it in a clear clerk's hand, and at the head of it he had written that this was the true reckoning to be kept against a day when it might be needed, and Hannah understood that he had meant the day when he himself would come back for the money, and that the day had never come, because the man who hid the box had lost the box, and lost himself along with it. She knelt a long time over the open safe. She was 19 years old and alone in a ruined building with more money than the valley town held in a year, and there was no one to see what she did with it, and she could have taken the gold and walked west and lived the rest of her life in comfort, and no one would ever have known the box had held anything at all. The old man did not believe there was money in it. The man who hid it could not remember it existed. The families who had lost it thought it long gone. She had only to close the door and tie the sacks and go. And she knelt there, and she did not move toward the gold, because her father had taught her, in the long patient hours at his bench, that a lock is opened to return a thing to its rightful owner, that a safe man holds other people's property in trust, and the whole of his worth is that he can be trusted with what is not his. The money in the sacks was not hers. It belonged to the widow dead in the poorhouse, and to the family gone east, and to the old man on his trap line who had lost $60 and 4 years, and to the others whose names were written in the honest hand of the man who had stolen from them. When Eli Boone came down from his line that evening, she had laid it all out on the swept floor in the lamplight, the 2 sacks of coin in the tin box, and the true ledger, opened to where the names began, and the old man stood in the doorway and did not speak for a long time. He had lost $60 to the Callaway Company, and he had never once in 11 years expected to see a cent of it again. And now there was a girl of 19 showing him in a dead man's honest hand the exact figure of what he had been cheated, $60 even, recorded against his name, and beside it the false entry that had hidden it. He sat down on an upturned box more heavily than a strong old man should, and he put his hand over his mouth, and when he took it away, he said only that he had been right not to be able to look at Tate. They did not take the money to the law that night or the next day. Hannah had thought hard about how the thing must be done, because she was the owner of the building and the safe was on her land, and there were men in the valley who would argue that the money was therefore hers by right of property, and she wanted no part of an argument that would set her against the families. She wanted the money to go where it belonged, with no claim of her own laid on it, and she wanted the true ledger to be the thing that did the work, not her word and not any accusation, because a written record in the cheating man's own hand could not be denied, and an accusation could always be called the spite of a girl who had found something and wanted to keep it. So she and the old man did a careful and unhurried thing. Eli Boone knew the valley and its people, and he went down, over the course of a week, and quietly brought word to the families whose names were in the ledger. Not all at once and not with any drama, but a word here and a word there, that there was something they should see concerning the Callaway Company, and they came in 2s and 3s up the mining road to the Gatehouse. The Marsh son who had stayed in the valley when his parents went east, the niece of the widow Aldous, the others were their children, and Hannah showed each of them the ledger and the entry against their family's name. And she let them read in the bookkeeper's own clear hand the truth of what had been done to them. She made no speech. She did not need to. The figures spoke, and the false entries beside the true ones spoke, and the cold coin in the canvas sacks spoke loudest of all. She remembered afterward the faces more than anything else. The Marsh son was a heavy, slow man of 40, who farmed a rented quarter section and had grown used over 11 years to the belief that his family had been merely unlucky, that his father had trusted a failing company and paid the common price of trusting. When Hannah set her finger on the line that read the Marsh name and the figure of $200 and beside it the false entry that had buried it, the man read it twice, and then a third time, and his jaw worked, and he asked her in a low voice whether this meant his father had not been a fool. She told him it meant his father had been robbed, which was a different thing entirely, and the man stood a while at the window looking out at the timber, and when he turned back his eyes were wet and his voice was steady. The niece of the widow Aldous was a young married woman with a baby on her hip, and she had been a girl of 12 when her aunt died in the poorhouse, and she read the entry of $140, and the date, and she said only that her aunt had gone to her grave believing she had thrown the money away through her own foolishness, and that it would have meant more to the old woman than any sum to know she had simply been lied to by a man she trusted. Hannah heard a dozen such things in that week, and she said little to any of them, because she had learned from her father that there are truths a person must be allowed to arrive at in their own silence, and that the kindest thing a witness can do is stand quiet and let the record do its work. There was a question, of course, of the man himself, of what was to be done with Alvin Tate, who had stolen the savings of these families and falsified the books and hidden the proceeds, and who now sat in the land office in his shabby good coat. And here the story turns in a way that Hannah had not expected and could not have planned. For when the matter was at last brought before the county and the true ledger laid open beside the false company books that the court still held in its records, and the two compared figure by figure, it became plain to everyone who looked that the hand that had written the honest reckoning and the hand that had written the false entries were the same hand, and that the man had condemned himself in his own careful writing, 11 years before anyone came looking. There was no need to confront him, and in the end no satisfaction in it. When the county men went to the land office to question him, they found a quiet clerk who heard the charge with a kind of terrible relief, who said that he had known for 11 years that there was a thing he had done and could not remember, and that he was glad at last to be told what it was. The injury had taken from him the very memory of his crime, and so the punishment the law gave him fell on a man who could no longer fully recall having earned it, and there was no triumph in the valley over his ruin, only the strange gray quiet of a wrong at last laid bare. What mattered, and what the valley remembered long after, was not the undoing of Alvin Tate. It was the returning of the money. The coin in the 2 canvas sacks came to a little over $4,000, and the true ledger named to the dollar what each family had lost, and the court, with the honest record before it, ordered the money returned to the families or their heirs in the exact amounts the ledger showed. The widow Aldous had died in the poorhouse, but her niece received the $140 her aunt had been cheated of and used it to put a stone on the grave that had none. The Marsh son sent his parents word and money east and brought them home before the next winter. And Eli Boone received his $60 in gold, counted into his weathered hand by the county clerk, and he looked at it a long while, and then he walked up the mining road and gave the whole of it to the girl who had opened the safe. And when she refused it, he set it on the swept floor of the Gatehouse and told her that a man had the right to spend his own money as he pleased, and that he pleased to spend it on the only person in the valley who had treated a forgotten thing as though it might still be worth opening. I will tell you what became of her, because the close of a story is owed to the people who have stayed with it. Hannah Crail did not grow rich. She had asked for nothing from the returned money, and she took nothing save the $60 the old man forced on her, and with it, and with the skill of her hands, she did the thing she had wanted to do since the men in Drummond took her father's shop. She repaired the Gatehouse. She did not tear it down, and she did not leave it. She laid a new roof on the larger room and reset the fallen stones and reglazed the windows, and she hung out a small sign, lettered plainly, that she was a locksmith and would mend any lock or open any safe whose owner could prove it his own. The valley that had laughed at her dollar came, in time, to bring her its locks. A locksmith is a person a community must trust, for she holds the means to every door, and the valley had seen what this one did when she knelt alone before $4,000 that no one would have missed, and there was no one in the Bitterroot they trusted more. Eli Boone lived another 6 years and ran his trapline until the last of them, and he took his evening meal at the Gatehouse more often than not, and the girl and the old man kept their odd company to the end of his days. The iron floor safe she left where it was set into the foundation, cleaned and oiled and sound, and she kept her own small valuables in it, and on its door where the maker's brass plate caught the lamplight, the rust had been rubbed away to a dull, honest shine by the passage of her hand. She was asked once, by a child of one of the restored families, why she had not simply kept the gold when no living soul knew it was there to be kept. And she answered the child the way her father had answered her long before at his bench in Drummond when she had asked him why a man would spend 3 hours opening a lock he could break in 3 minutes. A lock, he had told her, is a promise between people who will never meet, that what one shut away, another will not steal. She had spent 11 days opening a promise, 11 years old, and she had kept it, and that was the whole of the worth of the thing. The Gatehouse stands yet, they say, at the mouth of the old Callaway Road, its stone walls squared and true, its roof sound, and on cold mornings the smoke rises from its chimney as it did the autumn a destitute girl of 19 paid $1 for a ruin and found beneath its floor the proof that patience and an honest hand outlast every cleverness that ever cheated an honest family of its due. If you have ever been counted worthless by people who could not see what your hands could do, I think you already know what she felt when the boltwork shifted at last. The door of that safe is still there, rubbed to a shine by the hand of the woman who opened it, not to take but to return, and that more than the gold is what she left behind.